This next piece is going to be focused on the management part of the collection. And we're going to look at both like the physical and the intellectual management of it. So in terms of content, we're going to take a look at the proposed collecting mission as part of this collection plan, and that helps to guide several aspects of what comes next. We'll take a look at some administration recommendations that we at Relic Cura typically offer or include in our collections plan to an outside organization. We then get into the fun appraisal and accessioning. So using that collection mission and thinking about that next administrative steps of appraising things that come in and whether or not it's a fit. And if it is a fit, how you accession it. Getting then into it's an item in your collection now, how we process and catalog it. And then taking a look at weeding, which is typically an archival concept, but we'll cover here, as well as deaccessioning, which weeding and deaccessioning are two different things, though the outcome may be very similar. And then finally, displaying access is usually a huge part, whether it's museum or archive collection, as part of that management plan. So, proposed collecting mission, whether you are just starting out, relaunching a program, reevaluating, and perhaps refining or shifting your particular museum's collecting way forward, for all of those reasons, there's usually a need to either create for the first time a collecting mission or to update and refine an existing collecting mission. So, as a refresher, for those who maybe have never created a collecting mission before, a collecting mission should be based on a review of your collection if you've already had one in place, and an assessment of past and or current use. So what has the collection been used for before, if it's existed? What do we anticipate the collection to be used for moving forward? And then constructing 1 to 3 sentences, a very concise statement of what that collecting mission is. And what we need that mission to include is specifically what is being collected, including subject matter, the time frame, and the types of items, and having that spelled out within those 1 to 3 sentences so that it is very clear for anyone who's like, oh, this item just came in or is being offered. Does this fit? You'll need to be able to use several points of criteria in order to assess that. So we'll get into that a little bit more in the appraisal piece of this, but that's why we need those elements in this collecting mission. And if your current one doesn't have those elements, then it's due for a refresh. And then finally, the collecting mission itself, just know that it can evolve, and that's very much it. The evolution should be based on the organization's goals and any sort of strategic plans that may be in place for you. But regardless, anything that is set at that institutional level should be reflected in the collecting mission for your actual collection. So you may have like a museum mission, an overarching museum mission for your organization, and then this is a very specific what we are collecting mission. So 2 different things, though they should definitely see relation in each other. So when thinking about collecting mission, as you establish either for the first time or perhaps revamp your existing one, there are some questions and prompts you can consider as you go through this type of exercise. And especially if you are working with a board or a larger department on this, these prompts can be fun to work through as a team. First off, the who is the collection for prompt. So often thinking about our stakeholders, how the collection's being used, how and who are accessing it can be very informative to our overall collecting mission. And what that collection will be used for, having some use cases or examples can help be, for those brains that need like a specific example, can be very helpful for proving that point. How does the collecting mission support or echo the organization's overall mission? So again, what's the museum mission, for example, and how does the collecting mission support or not currently that museum mission? How will the collection be preserved, managed, accessed, displayed, and resourced? Those are all important aspects to have in place as we're thinking about a collecting mission. Specifically, and for example, if there are not a lot of resources available to actually provide collection care, management, and access, then perhaps the collecting mission needs to be very narrow and focused on areas, very specific areas of the collection where continued acquisition is desirable based on the resources that you have currently. And then for some of the institutions where there may be mixed collections or several different establishments of collections, like museum artifacts, archival collections, and reference collections, educational collections, you may have several different types of collections. And so thinking about how those are differentiated, whether or not they're included in a collecting mission, how they relate to each other, those are all important to suss out as well as you're going through this practice of creating and implementing a collecting mission. So administrative recommendations, this is an area that we typically provide specific recommendations to a museum or archives for helping that administration of the collection. So we're sharing these here in case it is helpful for you to think about as you're going through your collection plan creation. First of which, if there's no formal department, we recommend forming like a collections committee or some sort of group in place to help support the assessment, the monitoring, the decision making that help to shape the collections that are coming in, and perhaps shape some of the and inform the items that may need to be deaccessioned. 2, craft and adopt a collecting mission. So you've put together a team or a group, whether it's your own department or made up of staff, volunteers, and board members, whatever that collecting committee looks like, having that collecting mission be adopted and approved. And then after that, putting in place the appropriate forms and policies after that. But for the forms, specifically a deed of gift form, and we recommend an accession form and a deaccession form. Those last two forms being internal specific documents to support the management piece of it. The deed of gift, which we'll get into some more detail in a moment, is very much a legal document and very important, especially if a artifact or collection is being donated by a donor to your particular institution. 4, create a log, which can be a spreadsheet if you don't have a collections management system in place. And the job of this log is to help identify items that are coming into the collection, so that you can help keep track of those, especially for those that don't have like a full management track set up yet. 5, evaluate the current holdings against the collecting mission and accession or deaccession the materials accordingly. So if you've been waiting to do accessioning until you got the collecting mission in place, now's the time to start doing that vetting, using appraising basically the items against your collecting mission to see if they're accessioned. And for items that may have already made their way into your collection, evaluating those against the collecting mission and perhaps deaccessioning them. And then 6, identify materials that were donated by a source external to your organization. So, and specifically that are missing a deed of gift. So any items or artifacts that may have come to your organization, usually via a donation method versus like you paid or there's some sort of paid acquisition of an item. Not having that deed of gift in that donor situation can be incredibly difficult to do anything to that object. It does open you up for risk in terms of if needing to do any sort of collections care or deciding that it goes on display or is loaned. A lot of those decisions can't be made for those artifacts if you don't actually legally own it because there's no deed of gift on file. So there are, of course, areas and museums where things have come into the collection and we are not sure how they came into the collection, let alone who to contact for the deed of gift. That is actually fairly common among many museums, and there are some things in place that are not related to this webinar, but just know if you're in that boat, there are some different strategies you can follow to determine what are the laws of your particular state or region. What are some of the policies that you had in place when the artifacts came in the rough time frame, etc. So there is recourse if you don't have a deed of gift, of which, depending on laws, where you're located, etc., you have a path to follow. Okay, so for the appraisal piece of this, appraisal is the process that a museum or archives goes through to determine whether or not an item or archival collection is appropriate for you to take in. And when items are offered to your particular organization, there's usually an initial appraisal done by internal staff to gauge the appropriateness and whether or not that item should be added based on how it fits the collecting mission for your museum or archives. I will state this type of appraisal is very different and not the same thing as a financial appraisal. This is very much appraising an item, evaluating it essentially to determine whether it should be in your collection. And if the items fit within that collecting mission, then doing any sort of additional review to help inform the physical state of the item. Does it need any work or repair on it? Does it need to be fumigated or isolated for whatever potential pest situation that may exist? So any sort of immediate, and especially if it's like preservation related things that need to occur. And then just please note for the appraisal policy that you create for this part of your collection plan, I definitely recommend putting in a statement somewhat similar to this one, where it states specifically that your organization cannot and should not provide a financial appraisal for the particular items that are coming in. This is in keeping with the current code for both Society of American Archivists as well as the American Alliance on Museums, where the ethics of the museum or archives providing that financial appraisal is dubious. And so don't provide that financial appraisal. And if there is a donor asking for financial appraisal, etc., then recommend them to one of the official appraiser professional organizations for them to find and locate their own appraiser. So having that statement as part of your appraisal policy so that you can avoid and mitigate that risk, as well as be able to point to it for the donor saying, I'm so sorry, it's against code of ethics, etc., that we provide the financial appraisal, but please go check this other place out to find your appraiser if that's the step that you want to take. So please include that and note that in your appraisal policy. So once you've done that appraisal piece for your collection plan, you also then need to include how to accession. So for this part of the collection plan, there's a few different areas that we want to think about and outline for accessioning. And the three areas over here is legal, physical, and intellectual. So for accessioning, how can we do those three areas for the management of the material? For the legal aspect, we want to think about for potential items coming from a donor, a deed of gift should be used. As mentioned briefly a couple slides back, a deed of gift is a legal agreement that transfers ownership from the donor to your organization, and depending on what it is, it could come with copyright, etc. Because it is, if you're accepting donations from an external source, and you're doing it without a deed, it can be risky because that opens up your organization to potential future litigation of who actually owns that object, especially if the original donor passes and it's not being contested by the heirs. Also, it can help mitigate risk for the demand of return of that collection, and therefore sacrificing or forfeiting any sort of staff time, supplies, and other resources that you've put into that item with collections, care, and management, because you then have to return the item because it wasn't officially owned by you. And then as the deed of gift is considered a legal document for your museum, it should be vetted by some sort of legal counsel for your organization. So while a data gift is pretty standard and you can probably borrow one from a different museum and adopt it for your own use, it still should be vetted by whoever the legal counsel is, or if you have a board member who provides that legal expertise as you start using it, so that you know the cover your butt situation. So thinking of the physical aspect now for how to accession, when we're accessioning, we are accepting the new material, and we want to make sure that we establish at that point some physical and intellectual control. The physical control of that includes the rehousing of that artifact or archival materials in some sort of appropriate museum or archive quality storage, and that item should be placed somewhere that is in secure storage in a location that can be identified and assigned, and not just like placed on like a volunteer's desk, for example, because that's how things get lost. So being very intentional for once that item does come in, even if you can't work on it right away, that it receives appropriate storage materials and then it has been assigned an official, specific, and documented location. Speaking of, the intellectual control of this is documenting and controlling the information of the item or collection. So information about the item should be captured, and typically this is done within the collections management system. But if it's a spreadsheet for you, spreadsheet's fine too. Wherever it is where this information is documented, this is where it should happen. And for your collection plan, that should be identified in terms of where people should go to enter in the collection data. And then also articulate in the collection plan for this section what information you expect to be gathered at that point. So for some of the basic data to capture as an option, capturing donor name, creation date if known, brief description, and this can really just be like a brief enough fragmented sentences, bullet points, whatever, of what the item is or what the archival collection is, assigning of an accession number and location, and having those captured as part of the accession record. That way it's all in one place, and we have all of that information to help intellectually control or manage the object, even though we may not have had time to actually go through the full processing of that particular item or archival collection. All right, so we've appraised, we've accessioned, and now we are going through the concept of process. And so for your collection plan, this section should speak to how you want to organize your collection. And for the processing piece, what that typically means, whether it is a museum or archives, is that there's both a physical and intellectual control of a collection. So we did like a little part of that when we went through the accessioning of it. We are now expanding upon those two concepts as part of processing the artifact, artwork, archival collection, what have you. And that can include documenting what an item is and where it's located in more specificity, rehousing or improving the storage containers for the items. So perhaps we had enough time to put it in an acid-free box, but it could really use some different encapsulation or some more foam. And then any sort of need to conduct additional research, whether for provenance, creator, what have you, and then further filling out any known data on the item or the archival collection. Which leads us very nicely into the cataloging piece of this. So in your collection plan, once you've gone through the appraisal, accession, the little bit of processing, thinking about how that next goes into the catalog as a full item or archival collection record. And for your plan, you'll want to determine what the cataloging activities or steps should be to take place. For example, a spreadsheet or a homegrown database, or if you have a collections management system, so identifying what it is that your staff or volunteers or whomever should use. Identifying the data standards that you typically follow, the descriptive standards, providing examples for those descriptive standards, and identifying any sort of lexicon or vocabulary control, for example, nomenclature or architectural thesaurus from Getty, any of those lexicons that you may want to use, and then having those documented, whether it is you've always used those and now you're documenting to continue using those, or perhaps there was never really a specific adoption happening, but now at this point in time, we are now following these standards, etc. And then providing those instructions for how to capture that data that meets the adopted standards and the designated location. And so in this case specifically, is it the spreadsheet? Is it the collections management system? Where does this data go? How to weed the collection. So this will not happen quite as often, but it's often a good section to include in your collection plan. And particularly so if you are working with an archival collection, weeding or the concept of weeding tends to be more common in those types of collections. And that is because the act of weeding is typically not deaccessioning, because it is weeding very specific items that are either complete duplicates, non-original materials, materials that were prolifically created or produced, etc. So items that are not going to be unique, items that are not going to be like original artworks, items that are not going to be completely unique and original, that type of thing. Those are okay to weed, and that's why it is considered weeding versus deaccessioning. Deaccessioning is a bit heavier. There's some ethical and legal things to consider when you deaccession, and so there's a distinction in terms of the significance of the action based on what it is that is getting disposed of. And in your collection plan for weeding, it's very important to provide that criteria for what is being weeded and instructions for how to dispose of those materials if you are weeding. Another distinction for weeding versus deaccessioning and a disposal set of circumstances is that for weeding, you can often just like recycle or toss, or it depending on what the item is, perhaps people are interested in receiving those or collecting those. So you can very much find another home or other ways to dispose of without giving much thought to it. Deaccessioning, there's some more significant thought that should be put into it, as well as potential repercussion for the disposal piece. So how to deaccession, this webinar has this one slide. We will definitely have a deaccession webinar coming up in the next couple of months that will be all about deaccessioning. So just know that that content is coming and will be a whole hour dedicated to the act of deaccessioning and creating policy, etc. But for our collection plan for this webinar today, I do recommend having a section on deaccessioning, much like we had for weeding, where you can establish in this plan, based on the collecting mission, which items are no longer serving the collection, perhaps they never fit in the collection to begin with, and what sort of prompts should people follow to help identify those items in a collection that should be considered for deaccession. As you go through those and as you're putting this piece in your collection plan, thinking about any sort of paperwork or older policies that the item deaccession may be subject to that you will need to consider, and identifying those if they exist in the collection plan so that everybody is aware they need to check those. And then identifying the steps for deaccessioning, so including the attempt to return to the donor, to transfer the items to perhaps a peer museum or collection, or to ultimately dispose of that item from the collection through a variety of different methods as you deaccession items from your collection. So it's a little bit heavier. There's policy and whether or not there's a deed of gift involved to consider. And it's actually identifying something that is completely original, is not a duplicate, etc., that falls underneath a different deaccession policy. So for your collection plan, call it out for the management piece of your plan, and then attend the deaccession webinar in a couple months where we'll spend much more time on both this concept as well as thinking about and the creation of a separate policy. All right, and then collection display and access. So every collection is going to have unique needs specific to how it is displayed, how it is accessed, how often. And so considering for any of those items, regardless of collection, both the preservation and access needs of those items and how to best balance those two pieces in order to support the stakeholders and the users of your collection while also maintaining and ultimately managing the health of your collection. So in your collection plan for this section, including and documenting a series of prompts or specifications for you and staff to consider as you facilitate the collection, display, or access. And collection plan template for the future. So we covered collection care plan, we covered the collection management plan, and now we're in this last piece, which is thinking about that future 3 to 5 years, how this plan can help inform like the what's next part and the perhaps what's next priority projects. So first piece of this that is probably of most interest to everybody and is a piece that we typically include in the collection plans we do with our clients is a recommendation for priority projects to come up next in these 3 to 5 years. So based on what we know, based on the policies and the management that we've just established in this collection plan, what needs to happen next? And identifying 3, could be a couple more if you want it to, but 3 priority projects and helping to capture in the plan enough information that will identify what the project topic is, what the scope is, the duration, the output, and what resources you need in order to execute that project. And I recommend including this section for a couple of reasons. First is that it helps to move your collection forward and improving either collections care, management, access, what have you, depending on what those priority projects are. It helps to keep you moving forward. Second is that it is something that you can identify and document that you can then use as an advocacy tool, whether that is to your boss, to your board, to help lobby for and get additional resources or at least focus time on those projects, as well as a tool that you could use to help establish and build out a donor request, a call for donations, a grant application, what have you. And so having those identified and documented, even if you as the staff member are the one creating this collection plan, it can still be very helpful to use and point to as a piece of evidence that you have done the groundwork, you've done that assessment piece, you've identified it, you've scoped it, and you are now ready to execute any one of these 3 priority projects, for example. So it helps you not only have the information you need to like get started right away, but it also helps to demonstrate and convince whoever it is that you need to convince that it's a project that should be done and is ready to be done right now. More recommendations included in the collection plan is for future improvements. So maybe it's not under the auspices of like an entire project and is perhaps more broadly applied. But considering any sort of equipment, software, supplies, display or storage, contractor, consultant, personnel needs, like any sort of resources that you may need that can provide overall future improvements to your collections care and management. Thinking about and identifying areas where these additional resources can provide that improvement, and as you're thinking about care management and access, and if you have some specific examples, I definitely recommend you write them down while you're thinking about them. And then finally, gathering options and approximate costs for each of or all of those areas that you've included as resources. The more information that you have, including like different consultants or contractors that you may want to work with, as well as approximate costs for different improvements that could be made, can all be very helpful for you more quickly executing or getting that yes to move forward and getting those resources.